So I tried to mix up the talk with some beginner stuff and some advanced stuff, so there's something for everybody. So I hope that works. But there'll be plenty of times for questions. If anything's unclear, just ask me, and then I'll try to clarify it. So anyway. So in our everyday lives, we're exposed to many different types of environments. And some of these environments might sometimes be a little bit distressing. They might even make us feel a little bit afraid. And some of these settings are actually quite beautiful. And they help us feel a lot more relaxed and might lead to an increased sense of well-being. So I was wondering whether we can actually quantify this intuitive feeling that beautiful environments actually are associated with this increased sense of well-being. But the problem is, until now, most of the data we've had is things that are classically easy to measure. So for example, there's a lot of data on green space because you can measure that with kind of satellite data, or distance to parks, different types of land cover, whether it's like a mountain or an ocean, or measures of diversity. But if you actually wanted to measure, and then in one of these studies that actually used this data, they found a really disturbing finding where in low-income suburban areas, a higher quantity of green space was actually associated with worse health. And they asked in the study itself, could the quality of that green space make a difference? And it was one thing they just didn't have, a variable that they didn't have available. So if you think about how would you actually go around measuring the beauty of a space, you could go around in a neighborhood asking people, how beautiful do you think this neighborhood is? But you can imagine if you wanted to do this for an entire country, it would become incredibly costly and time-consuming. So it's actually not feasible. But luckily, a lot of us these days spend a lot of time on the internet. So the internet has become a fantastic source of actually gathering data on our human preferences. So one of the ways we can gather data is basically what people do, by just interactions on different websites or social media. So one of the classic examples, of course, is Google Flu. For anybody that hasn't heard about it before, in 2001, they wanted to do that because they wanted to kind of track the flu breakouts around the world. And normally, the CDC would publish a report on diseases, but it was a 2-week lag. So Google wanted to see if they can actually nowcast, which is predicting the present, flu around the world by basically looking at what people are Googling. So if you're Googling flu symptoms around the world, then that's a signal that flu is occurring. And it worked for quite a while, and then it didn't work so well. But it was one of the first interesting studies where we can actually say that we can actually track human behavior through social media or things that we do actually on the internet. There was another study that's actually quite interesting where they're actually using Twitter data. So they basically took about, I think, 10 million tweets, and they tracked the sentiment of those tweets over time, and then tracked that against what's happening with the stock market using the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And they can actually predict the stock market based on the mood just on Twitter. I don't think it's possible to do this anymore. There's too many bots on Twitter now, but that's what they did at the time. And it's not only about text that we type in that we can actually use to track human behavior. We can also use images. Like Flickr is a fantastic source of images. And in this study, these researchers were using images just to understand the different characteristics of different cities. But another thing we can also do is we can crowdsource data on a large scale. And for anybody that hasn't heard about Galaxy Zoo, there were a couple of researchers that really wanted to understand basically how galaxies were formed. But they realized they needed a vast data set, and they needed millions of images of galaxies actually classified. And they actually first attempted to do this themselves, and about 50,000 images later, they're like, forget it, it's not happening. So they created this website, and they launched it. And about 10 years later, they had 125 million galaxies classified. So crowdsourcing data is like such a fantastic resource, and it's amazing how much people actually want to just help voluntarily for a good cause. So I was really excited that I found this website called Scenic or Not for my purposes. It was originally created by My Society, and it's this really simple game that you play, and it's surprisingly addictive. All you just do is rate these images between 1 and 10, but what's happening in the background is that there's one image that represents every square kilometer of Great Britain. So there's about 1.5 million votes for about 217,000 images from this website. And if you map out all the scenic ratings around England, You know, the classic places you kind of like to go hiking to kind of taking that scenic view comes out. Just that, so that one image is actually it's a good enough signal to actually get that where beautiful places are around the country on a large scale. When you think about what a beautiful scenery is, you tend to think about settings that look like this. So they tend to be these natural places. But the thing is, we already know that natural environments are actually linked with increased well-being. So I wanted to actually understand whether the data I'm getting from Scenic or not was actually something a little bit more complex. You know, is it only about natural images, or can it tell me something beyond that? Of course, what I need to think about is whether we can actually define this collective understanding of beautiful environments. So you would think that normally this is quite subjective. You know, how can we ever come up with some kind of consensus? But there's some theories that actually argue that we might have some preferences that have been driven by our evolution. So for example, there might be preferences that are connected with that helps us feel safer. And so one of these theories is Kellett and Wilson's biophilia hypothesis. And that talks about how we have this innate connection to nature. So we find attractive things that kind of have aided our survival, such as fruit-bearing or climbable trees. But that's still the natural element connection. And I thought this theory was actually quite interesting. It's J. Appleton's prospect and refuge theory. So J. Appleton talks about how we like these scenes where we can look away to the faraway horizon. And that's, you know, that is definitely a safety scene, because when you can actually view your surroundings, you can feel safer. And it also talks about places that we also like, places we can find refuge. So it's all driven by these safety kind of ideas of safety. But of course, these are just theories. They're not going to be good enough for me to actually understand whether they actually work or not, because I need to actually test the theories. So luckily, I do have 217,000 images rated about 1.5 million times. But of course, if I wanted to manually understand what's actually in these images, it would take a very long time. But luckily, we've got neural networks that are really amazing at doing understanding images and actually extracting features for them. But before I go to that, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to what a neural network is, just because I know some people might not know. So I'll make it quick. So let's just think about the problem where you're trying to distinguish between a 0 and 6, and you're trying to write a computer program to just tell the difference between a 0 and 6. So you basically want to write a computer program to tell between different numbers. So one way you can approach this is just to write a bunch of rules, right? So you can write a whole list of rules. You know, if it's kind of quite circular, then it's 0. If it's starting to have like this line that's starting to reach up a little bit higher, you know, and then how much higher. And you can see that this list can get quite long, and you've only done 0s and 6s, and then you still have 1s and 7s, and they kind of look alike. So how do you have to write a bunch of more rules to actually distinguish that? And you can think that this computer program is going to become really cumbersome. It's going to take so long to run. It's actually not going to be that good. So, but another way to actually train a computer to learn the difference between different digits is to use a technique called machine learning. And so machines basically can also learn, just like children do when they're trying to teach them how to tell the difference between a cat and a dog. And all you're doing is just showing them a picture of a cat, showing them a picture of a dog, and then telling them what's what. And they learn by themselves to figure out which features they can use to figure out the difference. So they learn themselves to figure out the rules. So we don't tell them, we don't have to write a cumbersome long list to actually do that. And one of these machine learning algorithms is neural networks. And they're basically inspired with how we think the neurons in our brain work. And they're incredibly smart at doing lots of different tasks. So for example, this is how they would try to attack the problem that we talked about earlier about distinguishing between different numbers. We saw, for example, doing pattern recognition. So it could be lines and loops in terms of numbers. And if you want to start understanding different facial features, then you can start in building, like first it might be just some very simple edge detection, kind of building upon several layers until it's looking at certain eyes or noses and different features. So some of these neural networks, they're actually quite deep. So this is a very simplified version. Some of these neural networks have like 50 layers. So I don't know, maybe that's one of the reasons it's also called deep learning as well. And there's actually a lot of different types of neural networks. when you actually want to work with them. It can be a bit overwhelming when you start out. So they tend to have neural networks of specific tasks. So for example, you have a series of neural networks that are specifically for natural language processing. So there's like recurrent neural networks or long short-term memory networks. And these networks actually take a series of data. So that's very useful for working with text because the context of a word matters. You can't just understand a word by just seeing one word. You want that series to go through. So for example, take an example like twist an ankle or twist a truth. That word, that the definition of twist is very different based on the context. And this is one of my favorite neural networks. I haven't been able to work on this yet, which I want to. I need to find a good use case. And it's basically, it can actually use to generate new pictures. So you have a generator and a discriminator, and they just play a game. And the generator is trying to generate different examples of an image. So say this generator, is trying to, say the goal was to create a zebra horse. So the generator is constantly trying to pushing images to the discriminator, and the discriminator is trying to see if that image is actually true or false. And they get very, very good at this game as they go forward until you actually generate something that looks very realistic, so the discriminator can't tell anymore. And then you finally have something that looks quite cool. But I work with convolutional neural networks. And convolutional neural networks, the difference about that is that they tend to be 3D models. Because images have 3 different color channels, so that's part of the architecture. It's just geared towards working with images specifically. And I came across this convolutional neural network from MIT called Places, and it's actually very good at looking at an image and extracting different place categories from that. So if we look at these 2 images here, I've got an image of a skyscraper, towers, an image of an ocean, and it can guess with a certain probability several different categories. So I've just given a couple of examples, but you can extract about 365 place categories, and I believe about 102 scene attributes. So different, whether it's a skyscraper, a tower, coast, ocean, and you'll see some other categories later, but as well as whether it's man-made, natural, does it have a faraway horizon view? So quite a lot of detailed information. So what I did was I took my 217,000 images and I actually ran it through the MIT Places, and I did a kind of a statistical analysis to understand what features are then associated with more scenic images. So let's see what we found. Oh, and this is basically how the neural network works. So for example, so this is an example of valley, grass, or no horizon. So you can see, so from the left, I'm always bad with left and right. On the left, it's not so sure if there's a valley in it. On the right, it's getting more certain. I think it's very obvious with grass. So in grass, it's not sure there's any grass in there. And by the end, it's like 80% certain there's grass in there. And it also does no horizon as well, which we'll talk about later. So it's quite a lot of rich with different characters that you can get. Anyway, so let's see what we found. So unsurprisingly, scenic images are associated with natural features, such as coast, valley, mountain, forest, and trees. But I thought a little bit more surprisingly, we're trying to get a more varied definition, because I noticed people are also picking up as characterful buildings as being beautiful as well, such as cottage, lighthouse. There's also tower, castle, a few different other categories, and also bridge-like structures, such as viaduct and aqueduct. Unsurprisingly, unscenic places are associated with pictures that are like industrial, highway, because that's quite intuitive. Those are not very beautiful scenes. But I thought an interesting thing that came up was that images that have no horizon are also rated down. And this kind of ties in a little bit with Jay Appleton's theory, that the fact that if we can't see our surroundings, we might feel a bit unsafe. And perhaps that's why we're rating the picture down. I mean, I can't prove that for certain, but I think it's an interesting finding. And surprisingly, we just don't seem to like flat areas of grass. So that's an interesting finding for the green space debate, which I'll come back a little bit later. So this is great. So I found out basically about these characteristics of these, different characteristics of beautiful scenes. But the problem with the data I have is I only have one image per square kilometer. And I'm interested in understanding well-being, particularly in built-up areas, because that's where we actually have a lot more influence about how we can actually help improve people's well-being. But if you think of a city within a square kilometer, there's a lot of variation there. So if I just took one image and did a study, whatever I find might not actually be meaningful. So I actually needed to generate more ratings. So I made a few attempts as to how to kind of generate these scenic ratings on a more higher resolution. And one of the first things I went to was Flickr, which I mentioned before, because Flickr is a great source of image data. And so the idea was that people would upload more pictures in areas that are more scenic, and therefore maybe that can give me a signal for the cities. Or maybe people, tag photos as being scenic or similar words, and that might give me a signal for being scenic. So what I did first was just build a very simple base model to try and predict scenicness using data we normally can get. For example, population density might say something, the number of residents in the area, whether an area is urban, suburban, or rural. And then I started to see if I started to extract additional variables from other social media sources such as Flickr and also OpenStreetMap, if I can actually improve the model and improve my prediction of scenicness and how good that could be. So I pumped in different variables such as number of images people have uploaded in an area, the number of photographers that have different types of photographers in the area, because you think if an area is beautiful, then different type of people might want to photograph that area. Had to make sure the images were not in buildings because we're only interested in outside areas. So I used OpenStreetMaps to clear out the Flickr images that were in buildings. And I also looked at points of interest as well, because I thought the proportion, if there's a lot of points of interest, and we're going to have a lot of images in general, and so to correct for point of interest would be interesting, because that could also possibly be a signal. And so I also mentioned that I also wanted to look at tags. So I wanted to try and find images that mentioned scenic as well. But I also wanted to try to see if I can broaden my search and not just use the word scenic, because people might not use that to describe a beautiful setting that they saw. So another thing I did was I basically used a vert-to-back model. So a vert-to-back model basically maps out words into these kind of numerical vector representations, and it's based on how words occur in relation to other words. And we can basically use these vectors, because they're kind of contextual, to see how close different words are to each other. And you can use that, for example, to search for synonyms. So I trained it on Wikipedia data and then looked for words that were similar to scenic. It's all based on how what words they use to describe, similar things. And then I was able to broaden my vocabulary and broaden my search because of that, and find a lot more words that were related to scenicness because of that, and get a larger range of images. So what were the results? They were not that great. So I did find some signals. So if the number of photographers adjusted by point of interest was a signal to find a scenic area. And photos that are tagged as scenic or these similar words was also a strong signal to predict scenicness. But the model wasn't that accurate. And the problem is that on Flickr, people upload images for lots of different reasons. So for example, for birthday parties. So it has nothing necessarily to do with the environment they're in. It just could be this really fantastic venue there, so everybody wants to go there, and everybody's taking pictures there. And then I had this hunch that maybe if I just hone in on photographers that actually travel around the country, maybe that could give me a signal. But turns out there's this thing called bus spotting, and the people that actually travel around the country a lot actually do bus spotting. I didn't even know it was a thing. So that didn't work out at all. So I think that was a kind of an interesting lesson about the problems of using social media, is that you don't actually know what people are using social media for. It might be unexpected behaviors that might be influencing your data collection. So it's not always useful. So anyway, I mentioned neural networks before. So I wanted to see whether I can actually use neural networks instead to predict the beauty of images. The problem, though, with neural networks is they're really, really hungry for data. You tend to need millions of images to actually train a neural network to do anything. So they take a long time to learn. But I only have 200,000 images. I don't have 1 million images. But I learned that I actually can use a technique called transfer learning. So transfer learning is a technique where you teach a neural network that knows how to do something very similar to do something else. So remember before that I was using the places convolutional neural network, and it was very good at predicting different places and different scenes. So you can imagine that this neural network can already understand scenes, so it's not that big of a leap for it to then predict beauty. So I tested the hunch. I basically transfer learned on top of this network. So you basically remove the last layer of the network and you ask it, I'm no longer going to predict places and categories. Instead, I want to predict a scenic score instead. And then you retrain that network by pumping it your new images that have this labeled data of all these images with the ratings. And it did pretty well. So the correlation is about 0.66. So you're never going to get 100% correlation because you're trying to predict a collective idea of beauty. So this is like 0.66, maybe 0.75, or might be your ultimate, like the high-end point, because there's never going to be 100% consensus ever. So it was actually not bad to actually get that result. But let's show you how it did. So I thought I just wanted to test this neural network to see, are the results coming out that are actually intuitive. So I took images from another website called Geograph. And Geograph is a website where people basically upload documentary photos of all around Great Britain. And it's a really good source for something like this because it's curated as well. So if somebody puts an image that isn't very documentary type, then they remove it. So it's better than Flickr because it's actually kind of curated data. So I've got 200 images of all around London. I put that through my neural network and to see what does it predict. So one of my favorite areas that I find very scenic, especially on a nice sunny day like this, is Hampstead Heath. And let's see what it did. So these are all the dots of different images. And purple is super scenic, and green is scenic. And if you look all around Hampstead Heath, there's tons of these green and purple dots. So it's identified that this area is actually a beautiful spot. And this is the picture it picked up as being scenic. And this is its predictions around central London. So, and I saw there's this little path going up, and that's before I had a labeled map. I'm like, that's interesting, what's that path? And well, it turns out to be that's Regent's Canal. So of course it picks up on the parks, unsurprisingly, but I thought that was really nice that it picked up on the different areas around the canal going through. And this neural network is quite smart. It knows that, remember how we don't like flat areas of grass, we don't like areas around highways and networks. So it knows that if it's a green space, but it's not particularly attractive, it should actually rate it down. So it's quite diverse. And this is another thing I found interesting, is you find these clusters of green dots around areas that don't have any parks. I'm like, what is there? And this is picking up all the areas around Tower Hill because it's got those really beautiful historical buildings. And this is an image it picked up as rating scenic. So this is like the map of the dots I found. So there's it's picked up the blue dots around the parks, a couple of dots like St. Paul's Cathedral, Tower of London, Trafalgar Square. But you see that the dots are a little bit sparse. So remember, I still need, it's not really good for using for analysis because there's a lot of areas actually missing data. And that means that some areas will be overly represented compared to other areas. And that's not really good for analysis. So I wanted to see whether I can actually get better coverage. So I thought, let's use Google Street View images. But the problem when you're using convolutional neural networks is that they're very sensitive to the image type you use. And Google Street View images are actually very different from my classic image that was used in Scenic or not. Because Google Street View images, they're actually images that are stitched together. They've got these blurry areas. And the problem with neural networks and convolutional neural networks is they don't see the same way we see. For us, this image is pretty much the same thing. For them, because they're looking at it a little bit differently in this kind of technical way, these technical glitches just stops it from completely recognizing the image. It's kind of like a completely new image. It doesn't even know what's in it anymore. So I actually had to retrain the network, gathering new data specifically on Google Street View data, gathered a few more thousand votes, transfer learned again, and now I have a really lovely map. So I know where all the scenic spots are in London. So I got fantastic data, now excellent coverage. So that's what I've been now using. And another interesting thing about Google Street View data is you can also look at changes over time, and that's also something I've been exploring. The only problem with the data is that, so this is where it tracks actual changes. And this literally has happened, where somebody had torn down this ugly building and put a park in. So you kind of capture that connection or refurbishment that comes through. But the problem is you also have changes that are just driven by circumstantial, changes. So Google will do a pass. So the most prolific images, so we've got 2008, 2009, they did one pass all around London, and then 2014 and 15, they did a pass. But they just do one image. And so if there happens to be a bus going through, that image is going to be rated down. Nothing to do with the scenicness of the area. So unfortunately, that will send a bad signal to my my analysis that I might want to do. Of course, construction's a problem as well, because that's only temporary, but that's not actually informing you of the beauty of the neighborhood. The weather is also a problem. So it gets rated down if there's no leaves on the tree. So, and that's, maybe you can correct that by looking at the date that the picture was taken, but it is a problem. And occasionally, sometimes the camera has moved the angle a little bit, and you're actually seeing something a little bit different. So that's also kind of problematic. So you'll have a completely different scenic rating just because the camera's moved a different angle. So it does require some work. So I haven't used the changes in scenicness yet because it's not quite noisy. But I think it's quite cool that we think detecting beauty is something that's inherent to humans, but turns out that computer algorithms can also now detect beauty as well. But I think what's more interesting is that we've now found a definition of beauty that goes beyond that kind of stereotype that only natural places are beautiful. We've also found that built-up elements also play a part in beauty as well. So that means that now when I start to understand or analyze the connection between well-being and beautiful places, I'm actually able to provide something new that we haven't been able to do before. So I guess the main topic of this talk really is to understand whether beautiful environments actually have a quantifiable association with well-being. And in one of the first studies, I actually looked at whether there's a connection with happiness. And I had the great fortune to work with this data from a map called Mappiness, which is created by George McCarran and Susan Murata while they were at LSE. And it's basically an app. There's Mappiness 2 coming out, actually, so stay tuned. And so it's an app you just download and you basically sign up to, and then you get pinged 2 times a day as you're just going around your everyday life, to answer questions about how happy you are. It also asks you how relaxed and awake you are, but I focus specifically on happiness. And you also ask you a bunch of other questions like, are you alone, with your kids, or also what are you doing at the moment? Are you working, studying, relaxing, eating? It's quite a rich data set. And then if we actually look at the results that are just coming just through the Mappiness app, you'll see, happiness by month. Then usually, of course, the summer months, people are starting to become more happy. The winter months, people are becoming more depressed. Like January, I hate January and February. And it shows up here. Seems like I'm not the only one. And then, of course, we're starting to get happy as the week progresses, and the weekend, it's like, yay. And then Monday, we're like back to being depressed again. But so it's quite funny how we can track quite a lot of interesting things with this data. So what's really cool about this data is that I actually can measure happiness in real time when people are going about their everyday lives. And this is really important because if somebody asked me how happy I was yesterday, I'd have no idea. And you have the problem of recall actually affecting that data you're collecting. So the closer you can collect that data at the moment, it's a more accurate it's likely to be. And another thing that's interesting is actually I can collect data on an individual basis. So I can do something called a fixed effects analysis. So if anybody doesn't know what a fixed effects analysis is, it's basically where you're looking at changes in a measure. So for example, I want to see how somebody's happiness changes based on another variable that might change around them. For example, the change of scenicness in an area. And this has the benefit, for example, for correcting from things I can't measure. For example, the data, for example, some people are always happy. They always have this sunny disposition. And I don't want that to affect the data. I don't know, how that has an effect. So if I just focus on the changes, I've actually baselined that I've kind of taken that a bit out of the picture, and I don't have to worry about that because I'm specifically looking at the changes instead. So that's why it's very valuable to have this individual data. But because Mappiness is so rich, and it collects all this other data, I can also control for other variables. So for example, if somebody's at home or work, or what other activities they're doing. And this is important because I really want to capture that connection between scenicness and happiness and not accidentally something else. Like for example, somebody's just gardening and that makes them happy. So I need to take into account all the different variables I could think of that might show the same kind of effect, just to make sure that I'm actually capturing that effect. And also, because it's a mobile phone, you know your GPS location, so you can use that location to then connect that data with a whole bunch of other data sets. For example, you know, like the weather at the time, because I want to know somebody's happy because they're in a beautiful area, not just because it was a sunny day. I need to take the income of the neighborhood, you know, whether there's a lot of green space in the area or not, whether it's a natural or a built environment, because I'm very interested in that kind of connection. So I don't want to know that somebody's happy because they're in a natural environment. I want to know that somebody's happy because they're in a beautiful environment. So anyway, happy to report that individuals do report more happiness when they visit areas that are more scenic. And this actually holds up in urban areas as well. So yes, I was very interested in specifically looking at built-up areas because this is where we have more influence with how we might influence people's well-being, because we make decisions every day about what environments we create and what environments we destroy. So these are the results. So on the left, we've got taking into account all areas. On the right, we have built-up areas. The top line is scenicness, and you see we still have an effect. And so I was really pleased about that. So happiness is actually a measure of momentary happiness. So if we find, now that we found this connection, we can say that, maybe we can potentially justify, policy interventions such as making sure every day, places people visit are actually more beautiful. So for example, like parks or perhaps recreational areas at work. But it's important to look at different aspects of well-being, because momentary happiness tells us one part of the story. But what about other aspects of well-being? So if I found a connection between something more substantial, for example, like life satisfaction, or something like health, which I'll talk about a little bit later, then we can actually justify even more large-scale infrastructure changes. For example, more beautiful social housing, or large-scale investments in urban infrastructure, so that the type of well-being measure is actually quite important for what kind of policy decisions I'm actually informing. So I wanted to look at two other variables. So I looked specifically at mental distress. So there's a general health questionnaire on this study called Understanding Society. So Understanding Society is a survey of about 40,000 households, and they ask tons of questions about, it could be family life, education, employment, finances, health and well-being. And one of the questions is a general health questionnaire. So it's I don't know, sometimes you fill that out in your GP. It's like, how well were you sleeping, or how anxious are you, or just kind of how you felt in the last few weeks. And they also ask a question about your life satisfaction, like how satisfied are you with your life overall. So looked at those two variables specifically. But remember that I want to do a fixed effects analysis, and I wanted to focus on change because of that. But the problem is, so to get change on a survey where people live, change only happens when people move, and only 13% of the people on the survey actually move. So if I did an analysis only on 13% of the survey, I started to get really weird results that weren't really intuitive. Because so you could think that when they actually conducted the study, they did a really good job of sampling the population to make sure it was quite representative. Honing it down just to people that moved didn't actually give me a good sample of the people, of the general population. And it was throwing up funny results. So I had to really think about what I'm going to do. And somebody told me about a technique called filtered fixed effects. And it's a two-stage approach. So what you do in the beginning is that you take your variables that change. So any kind of individual characteristics, for example, your marital status, your employment status, and your household income. So you basically pump that through your normal fixed effects analysis. Then you just take your residuals and you average them, and then you could just run just a normal linear regression on the variables that don't change. So it's just a two-step approach, which then allows me to include the entire population. And well, the results were actually quite disappointing. I didn't find anything. So I couldn't find any evidence that people that live in more scenic places report less mental distress or less higher life satisfaction. And this is a bit disturbing because I did a study in 2015 where I actually found a connection between the people reporting higher health in areas that are more scenic. So this was a bit odd, and I was a bit worried because when I did this study, I took census data, but I only had census data for 1 year. So there's a question on the census which asks how you report your health. How healthy do you feel? You say, very good or not so good. You end up calculating a standard morbidity ratio, which basically takes your age and whether you're male or female into account. Because of course, people that are younger might report they're healthier, so you want to take that into account. And for some reason, females report they're healthier than men. Don't know why, but that's the case. So we have to kind of correct for that. And then I kind of looked at, do people report, better health when they're living in an area that's more scenic? And I found that people actually did report better health, and it also held up in urban areas as well. But there were two limitations in the study. So one problem, as I said, is that I've got health ratings at one point of time. So I can't do this fixed effects analysis, which is a lot more robust if you're actually looking for a study like this. And also, there is a possibility that healthy people might have chosen to move to more scenic areas. But what I did, I luckily had exactly the same question in the Understanding Society household study, and I ran the analysis, and I was relieved, yes, it's still there. That's why it's important to replicate research, right? To make sure you still find the same results in different data sets. And so we do actually feel healthier when we live in areas that are more scenic. So why the discrepancy? So I'm just speculating because I don't really know, and it's something that still needs to be explored. One of the things is the adaptation effect. So you have the momentary effect on, when you're happier. So you have the happiness effect when you visit a more scenic area because it's something novel and new at that time. Perhaps when you live somewhere, when you first move somewhere, you have that effect, but after time, you don't notice it. I used to live in California, take the beach completely for granted, and it's kind of something we tend to do. Another thing that especially Kahneman had mentioned is that the focus changes based on what the question we ask. So if somebody's asking me a question about my life satisfaction, I'm probably thinking in my head about things like income, not really the environment around me. So that in itself has an impact on your answer. So that might be why we're seeing that connection. But why do we still see a connection with health? Well, it could be a connection with physical activity, because perhaps we report better health because when we're in areas that are more scenic, we're more likely to engage in more healthy behaviors. For example, more likely to go for a run in the park. So that might be the explanation. So it'd be interesting to find out actually what's actually going on there. So I just want to end with basically, what are the implications for policy? So what I think is really interesting is that until now, we didn't really have much data on how, how a beautiful area actually affects people and what about the beauty of an area might affect people. But now, with advances in artificial intelligence and the ability to actually crowdsource data on this large scale, we're actually able, at the first time, to build evidence on urban design. And so we no longer have to be in the case where these design decisions are based on just the hunches of a few people, because they tend to be based like an architect or an urban planner or a developer. But there are kind of thousands of people that are being affected by these decisions. And other than a consultation, they don't really get much of a say. And I think it's fascinating that because the neural networks actually need a lot of data to be trained. And these neural networks, they need our human input. So we actually can create these neural networks based on thousands and tens of thousands of people's opinions and actually understand on a large scale what actually affects people. And I think that's the thing that people don't actually quite realize, that computers don't do things by themselves. It's us that's told them what to do. So what can we do? what can we say with my research that's so far? So like we found that basically there is an impact on everyday, there is an association with everyday happiness. So we could look at perhaps interventions such as that, like a very small, not so costly interventions, for example, just beautifying a crosswalk in an area. As we know that people don't like flat areas of grass, when we're actually introducing a park, we can actually build into the guidelines to think about adding valley contours and trees. And you think that this stuff should be in the guidelines, but nobody actually talks about the quality of green space. So we have actually engaged with policymakers to actually talk about the quality of green space also being important, to encourage people to actually go to that green space and engage in that green space. And of course, we also find characterful buildings as being rated as more beautiful, and also bridges. And so perhaps these are things we might want to consider introducing in more highly trafficked areas. But the most important message I want to leave you guys with today. Okay, I did have a summary, but I'll skip that. It's that the next time you pass a beautiful meadow or a beautiful bridge, take a good look at that view, because your health and happiness might depend on it. That's it.